All right. Good morning. Scott Luton here with you live on Supply Chain Now, along with my co host and trusted business colleague, Mr. Greg White. Greg, good morning.
Hey, how are you, Scott?
Doing fantastic. I tell you, we've been on quite a roll. Today's live stream will continue that. We've got an outstanding guest. We're continuing our collaboration on this show with Mike Griswold with Gartner. Basically, Greg, we've been sharing Mike's insights and observations and expertise around supply chain today and tomorrow, right?
Well, I keep telling people Mike's not only premier retail analyst in the industry, but he was a practitioner, so he knows of what he speaks, and he speaks to a lot of people in the industry. So all the information he brings is fantastic.
Yeah, agreed. So two quick notes before we bring Mike in. First off, if you enjoy today's live stream, be sure to check out our podcast wherever you get your podcast from. Today, we published an episode earlier with Vector Global Logistics, part of our Logistics with Purpose series, and we featured a group called Hungry. Lauren knows with Hungry. Fascinating story, Greg. I'm not sure if you've been able to check that out yet, but what a company on a mission to give forward.
Yeah. Our suite is across the courtyard from Hungry's. So I've had the opportunity to talk with some of the folks there. What they're doing is fantastic. First of all, it's a great business concept, but what they're doing in terms of philanthropy is great.
Agreed. Okay. And again, you can check our podcast out wherever you get your podcast from. So real quick, Greg, out of the live streams and podcasts, webinars mixed in, it's been a busy time, but what's one or two of your favorite moments here recently that really stands out?
Well, we had a great show with Sarah Barnes-Humphrey yesterday with the Super Trends series. I think the uniqueness about that is Sarah's perspective gives us an international perspective, right? And she's got a small tech company, so that's fascinating as well. And also having a longer series like that where we get to talk about the different aspects of supply chain is great.
Yeah, agreed.
I think talking to all of these people live is such a great opportunity for them to share their knowledge with the audience globally. And I think it's great. It's been a bit of an awakening for me, probably for you too, Scott, that we need to think and speak globally. Even when we think and speak, I find myself sometimes too often thinking about or speaking about the United States solely. And just on our continent, just on North America, there's Canada and Mexico as well. So we have to start to be more conscious of that. And I'm glad that we've been able to do that. And of course, we've been able to bring so many people, the young professionals now from University of Georgia and the supply chain program there, DC Sfregala, and her husband Joseph, who's going to join us on a later show. Those insights from people of all walks of life are what really energize me.
Agreed. And we're going to be doubling down our efforts to really represent all aspects of global supply chain, right?
Yeah.
I'm scared to say end to end after our conversation yesterday.
Right. Right.
Real quick. So hello to Kyle Reeves and John Buglino, who are both tuned in to us via LinkedIn Live.
Hey, John.
And Dusan is back with us. Dusan,
all right.
Weigh in. Tell us on Facebook where you are tuned in from. We'd love to find that out. Okay. Yeah. With no further ado, people aren't here today to hear from me and you, Greg. They
can't be with Mike Griswold on the docket.
Right. So I want to welcome in. We want to welcome in Mike Griswold, Vice President Analyst with Gartner, the world's leading research and advisory firm, who serves as a trusted advisor for over 15,000 enterprises in over 100 countries. So welcome in, Mike. Mike, good morning. How you doing?
Hey, I'm doing well. Thanks, guys. Thanks for having me, and thanks for the kind words. Always good to spend time with you guys.
Yeah, likewise.
Great to have you back with us. So, Mike, we want to open up today's segment on, we can't get enough good news in today's challenging environment. And, a lot of folks are suffering economically or health-wise or lots of other challenges out there. So in supply chain, we've seen a variety of really uplifting stories that are good news. So, Mike, what's one of those stories that's been on your radar here lately?
Yeah, I think maybe start with a general observation and then maybe a couple of specific examples. So I think in general, it's been fantastic to see how the supply chain in organizations has pivoted from what might have been their core focus area to other areas to help during the pandemic. So I live just outside of Boise, Idaho. We have a local winery as one example that went from producing wine and spirits to producing and using the alcohol to create gallons and gallons of sanitizer that they've then distributed to our local hospital system. That's one example. We have a couple of really small companies here in the state that make skis, high-end custom skis for people that ski, of which I am not one of them, would probably recognize the name and what they've done because they deal really well with plastic, have converted and started to make face shields for first responders and healthcare providers. So to me, I think one of the big takeaways I've taken from this whole pandemic is how organizations have been able to recognize a core competency and then quickly pivot to deploy that core competency to help in areas around the pandemic, particularly in the areas of PPE, which I think we all now have had, flattening the curve, PPE are now in our vocabulary that 3-4 months ago were not in our vocabulary.
That's right. Great point. Greg?
And new normal and unprecedented are reaching new heights of usage in the English language.
Exactly.
Right? That's right. Greg, what has stuck out from where you sit?
Well, on the theme of pivots, to be really specific, one of the things that we're talking about now is the potential shortage of meat and other food supplies. And what I've seen is food service distributors. So food service distributors, they service schools and institutions and restaurants. And what I've seen them doing is opening their doors either for pickup or delivery to the public so that they can go and pick up goods that might otherwise get wasted or not used in a timely fashion. So Buckhead Meats is one example of that here in Atlanta, but there are companies all over the country that are doing this. So, and that's going to be an important discussion as we talk about what's going on in the future, as we talk about what's going on with some of the packing plants and things like that.
Yeah, Greg, it's interesting. I know, Scott, let me just maybe fast forward us briefly. I know we're going to talk about the top 25, but one of the key trends that we've seen in these companies over the research that we did for the 2020 season is business model transformers. And Greg, that's a great example. And I was just on the phone before our call with one of the technology providers I work with in Europe who has a European food service type of operation who did the same thing. And now they're doing home delivery direct to the consumer. So this idea of the business model being transformed or at least slightly modified, definitely something we'll talk a little bit later about in our top 25, but that's a great example of that, Greg.
Great.
Yeah, great.
All right. Want to say hello to a couple folks that are tuned in via the live stream, from Patricia to Murgesh to Jenny Froome, who's been on the show before, from South Africa. Jenny, looking forward to our collaboration with you coming up soon, and the great SAPIX organization. Tom Valentine is on with us. Tom, big friend of the show. Love what Tom does. So that's just a few of the folks that are tuned in. So good morning to everyone. Okay. Want to share one other good news story before we dive in. Earlier this week, we talked about how Kroger has moved in to purchase 200,000 gallons of milk that was set to be destroyed. This milk was headed towards was made pre-pandemic for food service and schools. All those are closed. So they swooped in, bought the milk from the farmers, and used their infrastructure to get it out to food banks across the country. That is an outstanding story. And of course, when you do something like that, global supply chains rely on truck drivers, right? So one last note here. We talked earlier this week about an organization based in Oxford, Pennsylvania, run by Mr. C.W. Boyd, who's been in the trucking industry for 46 years. Unfortunately, as we all know, times are tough for the trucking industry right now. But despite that, their per mile rates being cut as much as 70% is what we've heard about, Mr. Boyd has refused to cut the wages of his drivers. And that is an outstanding piece of good news. And that industry needs more awareness. 311,000 for-hire motor carriers in the U.S., about half of those, according to the Owner-Operator Independent Drivers Association, about half of those 311,000 are single truck, private carriers, single drivers, small businesses.
Right.
And it's a tough time. So we're trying to give that whole industry, which is the backbone of supply chain, as much as visibility as we can. All right. So moving right along, although I'd love to talk for a couple hours on some of the good news that we see. Mike, really the main center plate item here today is getting your latest observations around how COVID-19 is impacting global supply chains. We're all familiar with some of the observations and the common observations we've seen across the industry. But what in particular here lately has gotten your attention? Give us the up-to-date Mike Griswold take on how COVID-19 is impacting business.
Yeah, I think when we think about the impact, I like to think about it in kind of three areas: demand, supply, and capacity. And certainly on the demand side, I think we've certainly seen significant peaks and valleys if we think about demand at a product level, product location level. And I think one of the challenges that organizations have had is being able to quickly respond to those changes in demand. Some of that will bleed into supply, which then will ultimately bleed into capacity. But I think right now retailers are focused on inventory acquisition, meaning, I think if we look at certain commodities, a forecast is relatively irrelevant, because no matter how much I get, I'm going to sell it all. So if I can get 2,000 pieces, I'll sell 2,000. If I can get 3,000, I will sell 3,000. But we also have, I think, a unique environment where we have seen demand for other products that had a fairly normal, predictable movement completely shut down. So now I've got a bigger pool of product that has intermittent or even no demand. So managing that complexity, I think, becomes really important. And I think one of the things we're starting to see, I've had a couple of conversations with a couple of technology providers. We're actually starting to see retailers become more comfortable with this idea of accepting automated forecasts, where, Greg knows this from his previous experience, getting retailers to accept a forecast or an order or a store order without touching it and helping it was really hard. And I think now, because people have so much other stuff to do, they're being forced to let some of this autonomous forecasting start to happen. And what I'm hearing is some of those initial results are really good, right? Automatically managing exceptions, automatically creating some of these orders. And I think the last thing I want to touch on the demand side is, we need retailers, and all businesses for that matter, need a mechanism to flag this abnormal sales history. Treat it like an event, because this sales pattern that we've seen, hopefully we don't see it again, right? We don't have a flare up, we don't have a resurgence of this a year from now. Whatever that situation may or may not happen, our demand needs to be categorized today. The demand that we've seen for the last 3 months needs to be categorized as unique, so that our applications moving forward can handle it better. So those are some of the things I'm seeing, Scott and Greg, on the demand side.
Fantastic. Greg, I want to get you to weigh in on what you heard there from Mike.
Yeah, boy, we have talked a lot about this, and that is, Mike, Scott and I have done a few television or newspaper magazine articles, and they keep asking about this. And particularly in grocery, one of the things that we say repeatedly is that part of the problem with managing demand is not the supply, it is how we manage demand. There is some person making a decision how much to buy, and who wants to buy 4 pallets of toilet paper when they think the demand could stop at any time. Someone can point back to that person. But using technology enables you to, one, solve the problem in the short term, and two, as you said, note it as exceptional and exclude it from future forecasts.
Mm.
And in truth, we've seen this technique work. This is a holdover in almost solely in the States, by the way. We've seen the technique of automated replenishment in grocery work in many countries around the world. Asia and Europe in particular already have automated systems.
Mm-hmm.
So we know it can work. It's just wresting that comfort of knowing my business more than any computer could out of somebody's mind and
trusting
and allowing them to, enable technology to help them solve this problem.
Great point. And, trust, we've heard that, we've made that observation before. Trust has been woven into so many conversations related to supply chain here lately. And we're going to continue to hear about that, whether you're trusting technology or your suppliers or your leadership, right? I want to get y'all to weigh in. And Mike, I know we've got a lot more to tackle from some of your observations, but we've got an interesting comment here from Patricia. And Patricia is following us on LinkedIn, but we couldn't show the LinkedIn comment, so we're showing it via Facebook. She shares, quote, in regards to PPE and other critical industries that are heavily dependent on imports, we should be rethinking the strategy and how to build a shorter and more reliable supply chain. Mike, I'd love for you to just get your quick take on that, and Greg, you next.
Yeah, I agree completely. We've got a future of supply chain study that we've done here at Gartner, and we're definitely seeing when folks are asked around supplier risk and supplier, how do we better mitigate that? We're definitely seeing folks looking at, India, Mexico, some of these other, I'll call them less traditional, but they're becoming more traditional markets. I also think, I've read a number of positions around some of this PPE equipment, that manufacturing continuing to be moved into, let's say, North America, Greg, to kind of expand that definition, maybe not just the United States, but North America, so that we can shorten the supply chain. One of the things that the pandemic has certainly done has raised the general discussion of risk assessment and has accelerated organizations' analysis of supplier risk and how well dispersed are we from a geographic perspective. I mean, again, to your earlier point, Greg, we saw some of this when you had, the tsunami, and we've seen this through earthquakes in certain parts of the world that have, made people at least stop and think about their supplier risk. This, I think, will be the final event that will finally push people to say, this needs to be a regular course of business. We have to regularly evaluate our supplier risk to understand, how we will deal with situations like this. I think this will be the event that pushes people to do that much more prescriptively.
Excellent, man. Well put. That's typical Mike Griswold fashion. All right, Greg, you got to follow up on that.
Well, look, the supply chain is simple. You build it, you sell it. Everything in between is a risk or a delay. Now, some of those risks and delays are worth it from an economic standpoint, but to our commenter's point, absolutely they can be simplified, and we need to be, as Mike is talking about, we need to be more aware of those risks and what the potential cost of those risks are, because mostly we have said, it's a risk that we use China, but we haven't quantified the potential of that risk. Now, one qualifying point I want to make here is that in the case of a tsunami or a hurricane or other natural disaster or even other pandemics or epidemics, we haven't had the human intervention of ceasing commerce that we had here. And it's unlikely that we'll ever do that again. But we have to acknowledge and somehow try to determine what the impact would have been without this seismic societal disruption. And also probably assess the risk that could occur again. I mean, if COVID-19 does flare back up as we get back to work, then it's possible that we could intervene again. But yes, the supply chain can be greatly simplified, and as some people have called it, a China +1 strategy. I would argue China +2 or 2 plus China might be alternatives. There are all kinds of alternatives as well.
Yep.
Yeah, Greg, you raise a great point. I mean, I think the other element to this you touched on, which was the basically a global shutdown of commerce. I don't know that this is not a value statement. I don't know that was in anyone's playbook. It now has to be in everyone's playbook, which is you might have pockets of your estate, pockets of your customers that will not have access to the traditional sales channel. That was never something we considered or thought we needed to consider pre-COVID-19. And now, in addition to the supplier risk, I think that we also need to build into our playbook the commerce risk and how would we get around that? Because we all saw, I think, to varying degrees from the retail side, retailers' ability to quickly turn on a ship to home capability, to quickly ramp up a order online, collect in store. I think that experience has varied greatly across different types of retailers based on how well prepared they were going into this.
Yeah. Great point.
Yeah.
Hey, as John Buglino shared, he agrees with you, Mike, how you kind of captured, excellent idea to capture this time 2020 as a separate event, though it is the new normal. It will not be the constant moving forward with respect to demand. So good stuff there from John B. All right, so we're going to keep real quick before we keep driving with Mike and kind of dive into supply observations, I believe. I want to give a quick shout out to Alex Muhammad Mohib, professor from Wichita State University, the air capital of the world.
Go Shockers.
And Richard.
I can't tell which side this is on, man. There you
go. Richard's joined us via LinkedIn. Praveen has joined us and has got a question we're going to try to get to here into the show a little bit. And Varun also joined us from on LinkedIn. All right. So, Mike, let's keep driving. So much good stuff here. Let's talk about some supply observations.
Yeah, a couple. One is we've seen across both the supplier side and the retailer side significant range contraction, which part of me says it's unfortunate that it took an event like this for us to realize we've got too much stuff. But there's been a lot of range rationalization, both on the supplier side and the retailer side. The question will be, do retailers recognize now the over assortment problem that many of them were faced with, and do we stay with kind of this constricted, highly customer centric range, or do we start to see kind of the proliferation back to where we were pre-COVID-19? The other thing is, I think a lot of retail organizations and their supply base have a pent up new item introduction surge coming at us.
Wow,
right? We have not had a lot of new item introduction for all the right reasons. If you think about retailers and their own stable of own brand products, right? That's pent up demand. The consumer products companies and others have their own pent up demand with new items. How we manage that surge is going to be really important. And for me, it will be fascinating to watch. And I think on the supply side, what's happening is I'm getting more and more interest in sales and operations execution. I've had 5 to 7 different retailers tell me, hey, Mike, guess what's happened? We are cross-functionally collaborating to solve problems. I said, great. Let's build on that momentum and let's start operationalizing and formalizing it into something that looks and feels like sales and operations execution. That's going to be critical to understanding as states and businesses start to reopen, being able to understand where my supply is. Do I need to move it? How do I move it? When do I move it? How do I put inventory in the right locations? That is all around why we have S&OE. And I think people are already being forced to talk and collaborate together. Let's build on that.
Wow. Greg, comments?
Well, I think that, to me, the interesting thing there is what Mike said about S&OE, right? We've talked a lot about sales and operations planning, right? But what do you do as the great philosopher Mike Tyson said, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the mouth.
All right.
Right.
Hey, I've heard that quote about 10 times a day, I think, in recent weeks, right?
Yeah. So how do you how do you respond? And one of the things we've talked a lot about here is response. And S&OE is about is about recovery and response in the realities, right? It's really sales and operation reality and execution against that. So it's interesting to hear that coming, and to see companies moving that direction. It also goes back to what we were talking about before, is there's so much, this makes me think that there is so much in terms of demand that merchants can learn about range planning, meaning assortment planning, right? How many SKUs of olive oil do you need? There's so much that can be learned from doing the things we were just talking about, Mike, in terms of demand forecasting and understanding demand in the store. And now there's good reason to do that. There's a possibility to fulfill those lower volume products in different ways, especially since so many people have become accustomed to buy online and curbside pickup of groceries. Right. So particularly for grocery, I think that's fantastic. I'm not sure we've seen the impact of on-range planning of other industries, particularly of fashion and apparel industries. All we know is that tops are selling at 2 to 3 times the rate of pants.
Well, so really looking forward to seeing, as Walmart announced last week, 2-hour delivery, and how they're going to be flexing their 5,400 stores. The months ahead, it's going to be really interesting times. As always, it's always interesting in supply chain and e-commerce here lately. Before I kind of shift gears and recognize a few comments and questions that we're getting in our stream, Mike, did you want to respond to anything that Greg just shared there?
Yeah, I think the supply, I want to pick up Greg maybe a little bit on the fashion piece. I think the S&OE component for fashion becomes really important, because I think, in fact, I'm working on a research note right now around the link between S&OE and how it helps, through a disruption, whether it's COVID-19 or whatever it might be. And one of the use cases we've added is for fashion retailers to use S&OE to think about seasonal continuity. So on a state-by-state basis, as states start to reopen, fashion retailers have to ask themselves, I think, the hard question: what season am I going to open with, right? And for product that I already have in my internal supply chain, let's say stuff that's already here domestically, what am I going to do? Am I going to open the doors in a highly discounted environment, meaning I'm marking down stuff, and that's the first experience that customers have? Am I going to skip a season and jump, let's say, right into fall? Right. If in some states I'm not going to be business as usual until June or even July. So using S&OE to have that discussion around, again, where's my inventory? What's my season look like? What's my markdown strategy going to be if I'm going to have one? All of those things, I think, are enabled much better through something like S&OE, particularly for the fashion folks. And I think that is the group that has been, to me, that industry is most at risk. Many of them were deemed non-essential, so they've been closed for a while. Some of their capabilities to do some of these online transactions have been limited. So that segment, to me, is going to be the one that I'm watching the most closely as states start to reopen, to see how they're going to open and how their supply chains are going to respond.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, that's a really good point. They have the greatest risk. They basically missed spring season.
Exactly.
They got to decide whether to shelve that. Companies like PVH, I think, is the parent company of Tommy Hilfiger and a number of other brands. They've decided to shelve their spring lines and bring them back. Bring them back next year, or they had at one point. So there are lots of potential options there.
A few more.
Sorry, Scott, maybe one more real quick thing, piggybacking on Greg. If we think about the alternatives that fashion retailers had in terms of the discount channel, the Burlington Coat Factories, the TJXs of the world, as a release valve for excess inventory, from what I'm hearing and what our research is showing, is that valve is gone. Yeah. Those outlets are full. Those outlets now have the pick of the litter in terms of excess inventory they want to take. So that lever or that mechanism that fashion retailers may have had in the past to let off some of this inventory steam, if you will, that's gone. Yeah. So that page in the playbook is ripped out. They now need a different way to think about that.
Well, That's right. Not taking anything away from the food industry, which has its own set of challenges. But gosh, leading and managing high fashion global supply chains has got to be a little more complex than cans of green beans, right? Because there's no no shelf stability there. All right, so changing gears for a second here, I want to recognize a couple comments and questions from the streams here. First up, Thabo on LinkedIn. He says supplier risk management has now been shown as an absolute critical day-to-day function, from raw materials, value-adding manufacturers, distributors, right up to LSP. Good stuff there. And then Varen has got an interesting comment and then a question that we're going to pose to you, each of you. Hello all, cash is king at these times. Customers are not paying as they can't sell cars. In turn, manufacturers don't have cash to pay their suppliers. How does one manage supplier relations at the present time without jeopardizing future partnerships? Now, that deserves probably a fuller conversation, but any quick observations there from both of y'all? And Mike, let's start with you.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and it certainly is part of the new reality, right? In terms of managing the funds you have coming in, how do you disperse them not only to your associate base, but to your supplier base? I think one of the things that we've talked about a lot here at Gartner and written research on is supplier segmentation. I think one of the things that now needs to be added into the way in which we segment our suppliers is, not so much financial stability, but how about financial reliability? How reliable, am I to that supplier's long-term longevity? And what I've seen some retailers start to do is kind of turn that pyramid upside down and say, hey, look, I might have a tier 2 or tier 3 supplier in the terms of how I segment them, but I'm a big chunk of their business. While it might be limited, the SKUs they provide me are highly differentiating. I need to pay them first. Where someone, say, a larger consumer products company that I know has a little bit deeper pockets, maybe I pay them a little bit late, or maybe I set up a deferred payment plan with them. But I really have to focus on these smaller suppliers that I'm a big chunk of their business, because if they go under, because I don't pay them, then there's a portfolio product that I now can't deliver to my consumer. So I think that the way that we traditionally have segmented suppliers, I think, is also now going to evolve with this new financial lens applied to it.
Greg, supplier relations?
I think one of the things that you've got to think about is, who do you already have a good relationship with, and who do you have a good open dialogue with, and go to those people among the first. And I agree, you've got to assess the relative importance of a vendor, and that doesn't just mean volume, as Mike said. That could be because of the uniqueness of their product. And very often the vendors that you're going to have the tightest relationship with are going to be your largest vendors. I mean, speaking as a retailer, it sounds like Thabo might be in the automotive industry, OEM automotive industry. So you know who your top vendors are, and work with them. And I think, look, the best negotiating methodology is complete transparency.
Yes.
Often nobody can make you do anything in a negotiation, even if they know why you're doing it. It's still up to you to take a win-win or no deal situation. So I think you've got to be really open with your suppliers, and you've got to identify who you can work with, and identify who you can. As Mike said, you can either create a plan with, or drag a little bit and get, and you might have to play on a little bit of relationship capital there.
For sure.
Let go or be dragged. One of my favorite phrases there. All right. So real quick, I'm going to read off 2 or 3 comments from the audience, and then we're going to dive back into capacity with Mike Griswold. All right. So our friend Claudia, who's going to be on the show here, I think next week, new business models can help solve the inventory glut. Good stuff there. From our friend Tom Valentine, he shares COVID-19 has made the demand for true real-time visibility to your supply chain, both upstream and downstream, critical. It drives S&OP and S&OE. Good stuff Tom Valentine, great to have you here. And then one more, which is going to lead us right into this next segment, is from Professor Mohib from Wichita State University. Goes Shocks, quote, "It is a great opportunity for us to update our current demand supply capacity AI models to be more adaptive. I think we are learning a lot now that we can be more predictive or even prescriptive during panic attacks." Good stuff there.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point. Because what Mike and I were talking about identifying it as exceptional, it's never forgotten by an AI model, right? Artificial intelligence is just actual intelligence that never fails, essentially. You never fail to remember it. You never fail to apply it. You always apply it equally. So that's actually a really, really good point.
Yep.
It is, and I think the AI piece of that's really important, because that will start to automate and capture some of these insights, so that when we have, I think there's a general school of thought that this, while we hopefully don't see anything like COVID-19 again, we will see disruptions that look and feel like this. And being able to use AI and machine learning to better predict how to respond to that from a demand perspective, I think becomes critical. The other thing, Scott, I want to comment real quick on Tom's comment. When we look at some of the research, again, I'll maybe sneak a little plug for the top 25. When we look at our top 25 research, one of the things those companies have invested in over the years is visibility and visibility platforms and visibility capabilities, compared to companies that aren't necessarily in the top 25. That has not been a priority for them. So that was a great call out on Tom's part, because visibility is huge and will continue to be huge as we deal with different types of disruptions.
Absolutely. I wish I was in the visibility business. It is going to be more and more. If we thought we've heard about visibility and the demands for it in recent years, just wait for the months ahead.
Yeah.
Hey, I'm going to call a quick audible and rip a page out of our playbook here, because clearly one of the things that got you
We're gonna pivot.
And that's right. One of the things that you, Mike and Greg, both got passionate about was that the fashion industry and the retail industry. We've got a great comment and question here from Patricia, who's with us on LinkedIn. I want to share this with you and get your take, and then we'll get to the capacity in a moment. The fashion. So Patricia says here, Patricia V on LinkedIn says, the fashion outlets are still closed, including online. What should they do if someone returns something? If they try an item at the store, why have they struggled to keep their online site open and shipping out? Comments there. We'll start with you, Mike.
Yeah, I think, that when I look at the fashion industry in general, again, I don't want to necessarily paint with a broad brush, but their adoption of technology, particularly science-based technology, has been slower than other areas, other segments of retail. So things like keeping up with distributed order management, keeping up with a demand sensing, a demand creation tool, inventory visibility, right? Some of those basic blocking and tackling capabilities have not necessarily been as high a priority for some of those fashion retailers, and therefore they have not been necessarily as equipped to respond as quickly to the surge in demand. Just because people couldn't go to a store doesn't mean they still don't want to buy clothes, right? So the ability to service that customer, I think, in the volume that we've seen, to Greg's earlier comment about commerce shutting down, or at least physical commerce shutting down, I think many of them were not equipped for that surge. I think the other thing and this is not a fashion unique problem, a colleague of mine, Tom Enright, has been talking for years around returns. And the ability to handle returns has been one of, if not the single biggest problem we've had in e-commerce on the retail side. And we've seen anywhere from a 15 to 25% increase in returns on top of fashion, which was already at 30% returns, because people are saying, hey, I can't get to a store. I'm going to buy 3 of these in 3 different colors and 3 different sizes. And, that volume we were not and are not prepared to deal with. So, I think, it's been a scaling problem, I would say, to answer the question specifically. It's been a scaling problem. And I think we're still dealing with the scaling problem, particularly in the fashion side.
Yep. Hey, real quick, Greg, before you weigh in, when Mike mentioned that just because folks aren't in stores, it doesn't mean they don't want to purchase clothes. Our chief marketing officer over here had a big, she was nodding her head. So you got two thumbs up on that point, Mike. All right, Greg, let's talk to Patricia's questions there.
Yeah, well, I think it's important to distinguish between fashion and maybe fashion basics or other apparel retail. For instance, Kohl's was very equipped,
right,
to both do outbound and reverse commerce in this environment. But companies like LVMH, who may be selling their goods directly, not so much. And those high fashion brands and high fashion retailers fall into the category. More of them fall into the category, Mike, that you were talking about. And I think it's important for us to distinguish between the clothes that most of us buy,
agreed,
right, and the clothes that the Kardashians buy, and they are different, marketplaces and different levels of technology. Though the opportunity exists at every level of soft goods retail, I would argue, to as Claudia was talking about earlier, to revisit business models wherein a certain portion of the goods are wasted by part of the model, right, where they are meant to go to TJ Maxx or marked down to some extent and then sold off. So if we embrace the technology that Mike's talking about, then we can be a bit more precise in identifying how many of which products go into what store in what colors, so that we don't have these massive over capacities of product versus what we know demand is going to be.
Right.
And a lot of that is driven by how merchants, I being a former merchant myself, a lot of that is driven by how merchants are motivated. You're motivated based on GMROI, and you do that by putting a lot of product out there and assuming that a bunch of it is going to get marked down. So we need to evaluate some internal processes as well in order to change some of these things.
Yeah, and speaking of evolving business models, Claudia mentions that today Alibaba announced online luxury outlets to attract millennials. So lots and lots of pivots ahead. Professor Mohib, Greg, going back to your comment earlier, he likes it. China plus one or two plus China. He gives that 2 thumbs up for that latter new model.
Lots of Wichita State love happening in the
That's right. Hey, Mike, we're going to dive into capacity. This will be our most succinct one before we talk about the top 25.
Sure.
But were you going to comment on what Greg just shared?
Yeah, I think I agree with Greg completely, right? We don't want to paint all fashion apparel retailers with the same brush. There certainly are some distinctions, and I agree completely with the observation on Kohl's. I think the other thing that people, and maybe it does segue us, Scott, into the capacity piece. I think one of the things, let's call them apparel retailers in general, and other segments of retail are going to have to consider is the markdown piece, right? We have some, let's call them maybe higher end apparel folks where, markdown is a 4-letter word, right? They're going to need to get over that. Or I mean, to me, it's better to get 20% of something than 100% of zero. So I think that's one approach. And the second thing is store-to-store transfers. I think there are some segments of retail, some retailers in particular, that kind of thumb their nose at store-to-store transfers. Again, I think in the environment, going back to Tom's earlier comment around visibility, I think having visibility and being ready to pre-position product, particularly, I think it becomes, if we think about the capacity element of this, the country is not going to open at the same rate. So large U.S. North American retailers are going to have to take a look at, where is this capacity going to open up? And do I have inventory there? And if I have inventory in places that aren't going to open up, I'm going to have to seriously consider, how do I get it to places that are going to open up? So that transfer piece, I think, is going to have to be a viable option for folks.
Yeah.
Greg?
Good point. No, I think that's an excellent point. And to put the goods in the right store to begin with. I mean, ages ago, we talked about micro merchandising, right, where you don't stuff a bunch of sweaters into the stores in South Florida.
Right.
I mean, some of that, not to that extent, but some of that still does happen. And it's, it's another part of the puzzle we need to address.
Yep. All right. So I've got 2 other questions, but I'm hoping we can answer these in lightning round style. They're not lightning round questions, but let's see if we can answer them very briefly, and then we're going to talk about the Supply Chain Top 25, which is always compelling content that comes out each year. So first question, and we'll pose this to Mike first. This comes from, it's Valentine's Day on LinkedIn. This is Joseph Valentine, along with Tom. They're keeping the conversation going.
Yeah, there we go.
Do you think contactless returns will become a more prevalent option in the fashion space? And Mike, start with you.
Yeah, I agree. It's a great question. Yes, short answer, yes, I think that's going to happen. I think the other thing that has happened, Greg talked a little bit about curbside pickup. I think retailers that have offered that are going to have to find a way to continue to offer that. I think we're going to see a split between the traditional buy online, pick up in store transaction where someone's going to get out of their vehicle and actually navigate a store, to a buy online, curbside pickup. So people are going to have to figure out, how to carry that service forward, because I think there are segments of retailers' customer base that have actually liked that transaction, have gotten a great experience. I bought golf balls from Dick's that way. So my question now is, I have a golf ball I like. Do I need to go into Dick's to get the golf ball, or can I do curbside pickup and have someone come out and drop, a box of balls in my car? So, in addition to that returns question, which was a good one from Joseph, I think this curbside pickup is another transaction that people are going to have to figure out how to keep going.
Yep. Greg?
I think that's an excellent point. And, the thing I would point out is that Mike probably buys fewer golf balls than most other golfers, because he is an above average golfer. By the way, don't play him for money.
Never misses.
I think that's a good point. Of course, things are going to change. How we both buy product, and I think we're really good on that side of the equation, though we are still learning things amazingly, this curbside pickup, but also in the returns process as well. Returns are expensive, and I can see, we talk with Tony Shirota and his group at the Reverse Logistics Association, we talk a lot about circular economy. I can see companies starting to get aggressive. Mike, I think Tom will be happy to hear this, Tom Enright. I see companies starting to get aggressive on how to prevent returns rather than facilitate them in a less costly fashion.
Great point there. And the RLA, the Reverse Logistics Association, is a great resource for best practices. You can go to rla.org for more information there. Okay. The really neat thing is I love when folks in the stream, as questions come in, they start answering the questions
with each other
and that dialogue. That's right. So
that's great.
Tom, the second lightning round question comes from Tom Valentine, and Thabo in the LinkedIn stream was answering Tom's questions. So he says, COVID has opened eyes to looking at technology to provide true real-time visibility to their supply chain. Spreadsheets are static, not dynamic. The supply chain is dynamic. What cost-effective tools do you see mid-size and small companies doing to address this issue? So a lightning round, Mike, what do you think?
Yeah, no, I think that's an area that I mean, I'll be transparent. I don't cover that area, so I don't have thoughts on the technology space. I know there is one. I know it's emerging. We have some visibility, lots of visibility research. I guess if anyone is looking for more insights on that, just have them. Guys can just ping me, mike.griswold@gartner.com, and I can forward some stuff to you. But it's just not an area that I spend time in.
Yep, fair enough. Greg?
I think a lot of companies are compiling their own using business intelligence, or whatever the heck we're calling it these days, types of tools, and real-time integrating into their systems, but also integrating into generally available information on the internet as well. And there are innumerable solutions in that regard.
Yeah, great point. Hey, and just a couple tools that we've leveraged currently or previously that have been really effective. Slack, of course, is getting a lot of air cover right now, as much as Zoom. Zoom and Slack, I tell you, it's been a feasting frenzy. And then Trello is it doesn't quite get as much visibility, but Trello is a really interesting tool we've seen good, successful collaboration take place on. All right, so we're going to move right along. As much as I'd love to keep up the Q&A, it's my favorite part of these live streams and our webinars. But Mike, let's talk about the Gartner supply chain top 25 for 2020.
Sure.
And for the sake of time, we're going to move past the background. We'll have to share some of that next time.
Sure.
But let's talk about the criteria that you bake into the 2020 rankings, and any new updates on that over 2019.
Yeah, sure. So we've been doing this this will be year 16. The list starts with Fortune and Forbes company list, need to be publicly traded, 12 billion in revenue, need to have a supply chain, need to have 50% of your revenue coming from physical products. So that gets us to a list of around 300 companies globally. So that's around the world. Across different industries, different segments. So it gives us a pretty good population to start with. The criteria itself is 50% financial measures. So the publicly traded companies, we gather all their financials. We look at return on physical assets, which is new this year. I'll talk about that briefly. Revenue and inventory turns. We've enhanced what we used to call CSR, corporate social responsibility. We've now enhanced that to what we call ESG, environmental, society, and governance, because we've added a couple of new measures to that. So, and then the other 50% is a 25% peer vote. So supply chain professionals, like I'm sure many of the people on this event right now, cast votes. We had 150-ish this year, and then we have an analyst component, right? All of that goes into the hopper. And out spits, an index composite score for each of those measures, and then that's how we create the ranking. We have 5 companies that are masters. Those companies have had a top 5 composite score 7 in the last 10 years.
Wow.
And then we rank the other companies in that pool of 300 to get our list of 25. So at a very high lightning round, that's how the methodology works. In terms of 2020, though, we made some what I feel are pretty significant changes. So we moved from return on assets to a return on physical assets, which means we've tightened the calculation to really be the assets the supply chain controls. Property, plant, equipment, and inventory. And then we took out of the numerator the other. So if you think about the calculation, total assets on the top, which would include things that happen from acquisitions that the supply chain doesn't control. So we stripped all of that out. And it had probably the biggest impact on shaping the list is that change to return on physical assets. The other thing that we did that I think had a pretty substantial change is we increased the weighting on the ESG component. It was 10% of the weighting. Now it's 15% of the weighting because we added 2 new measures. So we had already done a lot around the environment. So working with UN Global Compact, GRI, CDP. So folks that deal in the CSR environment will recognize those names. And now we've added Ethisphere and Bloomberg to provide us an ethical company list and a gender equality index. So we've now added that into the mix in terms of how we evaluate the supply chains. And then we lowered the weighting on inventory. I won't go into all the gory details around that. We just lowered that. So the 5 inventory was 10. It's now 5. We took the 5 and gave it to ESG. The last thing that I want to call out, and I'm doing my best to over communicate this, is we added CSR in 2016 based on feedback from the community and a recognition that the supply chain was being instrumental in driving sustainability for organizations. We also recognized in 2020 that there's also work that organizations are doing around their workforce, which is why we wanted the ethical company representation and we wanted the gender equality. In general, we recognize the huge contributions that supply chains make in driving a better planet, in driving sustainability. So in that regard, beginning in 2021, if an organization has 0 for an ESG score, they will not be ranked. What does that mean? I can tell you right now, there are 2 companies in that list of 30 that have 0 for ESG. And in 2022, companies will need a minimum score of 3. So it is hugely important to us It's hard for me to say you are one of the 30 best supply chains in the world if you have an ESG score of 0. What I'm not saying is that those companies don't care about the planet. What I am saying is the work that they're doing is not recognized by our methodology, and that's important to us.
Excellent. There's so much to
Wow.
tackle. Real quick, though, for the sake of time, Mike, we got a question from Varun asked about is the top 25 available as a download? What's the best avenue for folks to check that out?
Yeah, so with all of the disruption, we typically reveal this at our biggest supply chain events. Those have all been postponed. So we're doing a live webinar on May 19th where we will do the reveal of the companies. We'll also talk about, I alluded to briefly, one of the key trends, the business model transformers. We've got 3 trends. So that webinar on the 19th is 10 a.m. Eastern time, open to anyone and everyone that's interested in learning more about the top 25. And then I'll be doing a replay of that at 8 p.m. the night of the 19th for folks in Asia Pacific. So the 19th is when we will reveal that in the webinar, and then the published note should be available noonish right after the webinar.
Yep, outstanding. All right, so Greg, coming back to you. So quick follow-up on what Mike shared prior to that webinar, and then we're fortunate to have Mike come back after the big reveal, the week after, and take a deeper dive. Right. So speak first to a lot of what Mike shared around the rankings.
Well, I mean, first of all, I think that one of the most important things is the increased value of ESG there. Because that goes to a lot of the things that are becoming prominent in supply chains. What we've seen is that, and Mike, it seems like it wasn't so long ago that we were saying supply chain is no longer a necessary evil.
Mm-hmm.
It's a competitive differentiator, and now I think it's even more than that. It is a big portion of your brand identity, because because people can easily find out some of the ESG components of your supply chain. They can find out if your supply chain is efficient and cost effective, and if you have forced labor or inequality or any or unsustainable practice in your supply chain, then that is reflected on your entire brand. I mean, entire brands are being implicated, and the consumer, as the consumer has become more empowered, that's a more valuable component of the evaluation of supply chain. So, to me, the big thing there is that Gartner and Mike in particular have taken the time and effort to make sure that we're promoting ethical, fair business practice as well as efficient and cost-effective practice.
Outstanding. Hey, real quick, before we talk about the other webinars or follow up on that commentary, I want to point out to our audience that, especially those on LinkedIn, Amanda has posted a link to the Gartner reveal, the registration link, so you can go straight there.
Oh, thank you.
You bet. And then, of course, we've got our follow-up event May 27th, and you can find that there at supplychainradio.com. Mike, I think you were going to follow up on what Greg just shared.
Yeah, just real quick, just a kind of a quick decomposition of what we look at. Just as one example to Greg, what you were speaking about, when we get, we partner with CDP, as I mentioned, folks submit their sustainability efforts to CDP and they get graded.
Mm-hmm.
Just as one small component, CDP grades on carbon, water, and forests.
Right.
So it is a very encompassing approach to how we're treating the planet. And again, Greg, to your point, I think it just reemphasizes, I started at AMR, it feels like a long time ago. We wrote a book called Supply Chain Saves the World. It was probably well ahead of its time, but I think, it's probably not hyperbole to say that the supply chains of today are, in fact, maybe not saving the world, but they're definitely helping the world get through this pandemic. And I've never seen, other than, we may have joked about this last time, other than, Jack Ryan on the Amazon series as a supply chain analyst, that made supply chain cool. I think we've never had as much exposure, good and bad, around the supply chain and what it does for the world, throughout this pandemic.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah, completely agree.
All right, we got to wind the conversation down. We got a little bit of feedback from John B on LinkedIn. I really enjoyed the session. Thanks for continuing to bring value, Scott, Greg, and Mike. So really appreciate that. Appreciate everybody that tuned in. We're going to go over just a minute or two here, but we want to make sure folks know where to go to get more information. We have put the Gartner direct link out, I think, across all 5 of our social feeds. The webinar, the follow-up webinar with Mike Griswold, where we're going to dive deeper, is May 27th. You can find that on our site. And bring your folks, everyone tune in. The thing is, as much as Greg and I both enjoy Mike Griswold's insights and perspective, get all the comments and the questions from the audience. That makes it even better, hopefully, for everyone. So bring that with you, whether you go to the Gartner webinar or you come to ours. Bring your voice with you. We want to dive into that and pose your questions and comments to Mike. All right. Beyond the Gartner webinar, we want to offer up one other great resource to folks. Of course, unfortunately, hurricane season is right around the corner. That will certainly make things even more challenging for many global supply chains. There's a free webinar with the folks over at Resilience 360 coming up on May 14th. And you can get a lot of their insights on how to mitigate and manage the risk associated with the upcoming hurricane season. And then finally, 2 quick points. And Mike, thanks for being a great sport here. Greg, we've got supply chain trivia coming up May 13th, a little departure from most of our content, right?
Yes. Yeah. Well, I mean, will Mr. Inventory, Dimitrios Koulas, will he defend his title belt? It was a very close race between he and several other experts. Mike, if you have the time, I'd love to see you sign up.
Okay.
But I'm going to say, depending on your level of comfort, you may want to use an alias, because I have a feeling Dimitrios was not as confident that he could win as he wanted to be, and he didn't reveal himself personally until right at the end. So,
well, it was what a great fun event, right? Go ahead.
It is, and we're using a new platform. We had a few glitches the last time, but we're using a new platform, and we're going to make sure that everyone gets to participate. We had Nikhil in India at 2:40 and 2:30 in the morning.
Wow.
His time, actually competing strongly until finally internet slowdowns just kind of disabled him. But anyway, we hope we've solved a big portion of that this time around.
Always continuous improvement. We all, it's a journey, never with a finish line. Hey, Jenny Froome, who's doing some big things with SAPIX in South Africa for supply chain. She chimes in with, "It's true that dark clouds have silver linings." Absolutely, Jenny. We appreciate that. Hope you and your family are doing well. One last thing, we are leading a breakout session on the future of supply chain at the Vetlanta third quarter Q3 summit. That's going to be May 14th. KPMG is hosting that, but come check that out. We've got Terry O'Hanlon with Gray Orange. We have Kathy Morrow Robertson with Logistics T&I, Trends and Insights, all both sitting on that panel. Greg, that's going to shape up to be an outstanding event, right?
Yeah, I think it will. That'll be interesting. The juxtaposition of supply chain and veteran careers, right?
That's right. You can learn more at supplychainradio.com for any of that. Hey, if you can't find one of the things we mentioned today, whether it's a Gartner resource or one of the other things, shoot us a note to Amanda at supplychainradio.com, and we'll serve as a resource for you. Hey, Mike, if you could give us one final challenge or key observation that folks really need to take from this conversation, and let's make sure folks know how to reach out to you.
Yeah. So Mike.Griswold at Gartner.com. I think the thing that I've observed is that no one organization gets through this alone. It's about the ecosystem of partners that you've created, to Greg's earlier point around suppliers and the question around suppliers. Everyone needs to be comfortable reaching out across their ecosystem to get through this, because no one will get through this in isolation.
Outstanding. And folks, even though Mike and the list is top 25 list is focused on these large global companies, I promise you, whether you're a small business leader, mid-sized business, you're going to have some great key takeaways that will improve your organization. Right, Greg?
No doubt. Yeah, I mean, there are things that any size entity can learn from what the best in the industry are doing. And as Mike said, they're sort of limited to assessing public companies because so much of the data that they want is available. But that doesn't mean that there's not a lot that companies of any size can apply here.
Yep. Well said, both of you gentlemen. Hey, it's been a pleasure. Thanks so much, Mike, for your time once again this month. Greg, the same for you. I love these conversations. I love the interaction with the audience. I've got about 8 pages of notes, Mike. So thanks so much. I want to thank Mike Griswold, Vice President Analyst with Gartner, for joining us here today, along with Greg White, my co-host and trusted business advisor. To our audience, thanks so much for bringing it today. We look forward to our next live stream with you. And with all that said, have a great week. Stay safe, everybody. Brighter days certainly lie ahead, and we'll see you next time here at Supply Chain Now. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
We out.